Greetings, climbers. Welcome again to Baden Hill. We're going to talk now about a civil war, a fight that has not ended, at least not officially. This civil war takes place in China. We've already talked a little bit about the beginnings of that civil war, how it grew from the revolution of 1911, led by Sun Yat-sen, and the fact that Sun Yat-sen was trying to unify a country that didn't want to be unified. When Sun Yat-sen became president of the new Republic of China, he saw the writing on the wall. He knew that he needed the military, and Yuan Shikai, who was the general who basically switched sides from the Qing dynasty to support this new republic, he was mainly doing it because he would get the benefit of becoming the president. And so in return, he agreed to force the child emperor Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, he forced that emperor to abdicate or leave his throne. And so even though Sun Yat-sen is the president, it was a very short amount of time, a month, 2 months, and then Yuan Shikai became the second president of the Republic of China. Well, he was basically a failure as a president. Sun Yat-sen was trying to create an opposition party, the KMT party, the Kuomintang party, and still he was forced to leave China, and then the emperor, the new emperor, President Yuan, failed as a leader, and that led to a period of total disunity, and we call it the warlord period. So that was a little bit of a recap of what we've talked about already. And you know that China is at a precarious point in its history because it's lost the unity that had been developed over thousands of years through the dynasties and the emperors, and now it's every person for him or herself. Well, Sun Yat-sen had a protege, had an heir, and that protege, Chiang Kai-shek, was actually married to Sun Yat-sen's sister-in-law. So the two men married two sisters. And it's very interesting because that develops over the course of history. Chiang Kai-shek's wife was Song Mei-ling, and she was really a remarkable woman. She was very well educated. She spoke English as a native speaker, even though she had just trained at boarding schools, and was considered a shining light within the Republic of China. And you'll see later on, as World War II heats up, she actually is a representative. She goes to the United States, and she is the first woman ever to address the United States Congress, the joint session of Congress. And basically, she was trying to get support for the United States to help China in its war against Japan. So you have the nationalist government of the Republic of China, but you also have this growing Communist Party. Now they have risen and fallen, and remember, the First United Front brought them together, but that fell apart because of what we call the White Terror, the Shanghai Massacre, when Chiang Kai-shek realized that the communists were not just going to get in line behind him, they were going to be his rivals, and the peasants were really enjoying the fact that the communists were helping to win victories against the warlords in the First United Front. And as a result, the Communist Party was gaining a lot of support from the peasants, and Chiang Kai-shek realized this threat. And so he tried to decapitate the organization, and literally, probably, some of its leaders. So the idea is that he got rid of communists, he purged them, and that was the Shanghai Massacre. But then it grew over time, over the next 15 years, and we call it, the whole period we call the White Terror, as communists were persecuted. So we will talk about that more in a little bit. In 1931, remember that the Manchurian incident happened. Japan was encroaching in China and taking over Manchuria. That's where the Qing dynasty had come from, but it was still considered to be part of China in the northeast. And so that's 1931. And Chiang Kai-shek had been having trouble. People were questioning his leadership. Lin Sun had been the president, and Chiang Kai-shek was kind of held at arm's length until the country realized that it needed Chiang Kai-shek again, and so he took over once more. And he was, we would say, hell-bent on getting rid of the communists and also fighting the Japanese. And it developed into a two-front war that was ongoing. And this is really why Chiang Kai-shek lost, because he didn't have a single-mindedness in his focus. And so in 1934, Chiang was fighting the communists, and he had driven them to Jiangxi, which is, you know your provinces now, so just know it was a mountainous region, and Jiangxi is where the communists had their hideouts. And basically they were able to still function there, even though they were, being attacked and surrounded even by Chiang's forces. They were able to carry out guerrilla warfare and survive. But finally, Chiang Kai-shek in 1934, he created his biggest army, basically forcing everybody to join him to fight these communists. And the communists realized that they were in trouble, and they had to leave. Now, I want to mention briefly, there were two leaders of the Communist Party, Li San and Mao Zedong. Okay, so Li and Mao. Li was a more traditional communist. He had been trained and supported by the Soviet Union, and he had this relationship with the Comintern, which was the Communist International Organization that wanted to spread communism throughout the world. But Li San believed that the revolution should happen in the cities, that was the traditional way. The workers in the cities would lead the revolution. He didn't understand that it was the peasants that were the ones who were going to support this revolution. And so Li San tried to fight back against the KMT, the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's party and army, and he failed miserably. And as a result, his leadership was it was tainted, and 28 students from Russia, Chinese students that had been trained, came, and they were going to replace him basically. And so Li basically is no longer a part of the picture. But there is another rising star, Mao, and Mao takes leadership. He believes in the peasant revolution. He also sees the writing on the wall. I use that phrase a lot. And he realizes he needs to evacuate the communists because Chiang has an army that they can't fight. And so he begins what's called the Long March. This is taking 100,000 troops, his communist troops, the ragtag army, and he's going to evacuate and go from Jiangxi province all the way up 10,000 miles to Shanxi. So he goes from Jiangxi to Shanxi, and it's this massive maneuver. In crossing a river alone, he lost half of his forces just crossing the big river. And when he finally arrived, he only had 10% of his forces left. Well, you might think that the Communist Party is done, but it wasn't. It survived. And eventually, the Japanese became a bigger threat than the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek realized that maybe he couldn't fight the Japanese alone. His generals wanted him to join together with the communists and have the Second United Front. Chiang refused, Eventually, he would be forced to give in, but he got rid of his generals who had recommended this course of action, and they had tried to basically carry out a coup against him. And so he was basically getting revenge. But maybe if you're a military leader, you see that as justice, that if you're the people under you, if they are rising up to overthrow you, then you put them down. That's military law. No mutinies allowed. So the Second United Front was the joining together of the communists and the nationalists to fight the Japanese. And it's all going to be happily ever after, right? Nope. Well, long story short, the Japanese were defeated, but it happened because the United States was brought into the war through Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. As a result, Chiang said, yay, we don't have to fight alone. The Americans were fighting the Japanese and pulled the Japanese resources away. But Chiang lost face. He lost face with his own people because he was allowing somebody else to do the fighting. And so even though China was able to win World War II against Japan, there was huge peasant support now for communism and Mao's army. And when Manchuria was left by the Japanese, when it was given back by the Japanese, there was a race for Manchuria, and there was a race throughout the whole country to see who could take over the territory, who could fill the vacuum. And the communists kept taking over more territory. They took over city after city, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this is how the first chapter of this civil war in China ends and a new chapter begins. Well, Chiang Kai-shek began a process of breaking with the Communist Party back in 1927. We've already mentioned that he saw Mao and the communists as his rivals, and he decided to do something about it. And what he did was called the White Terror. Now, the White Terror was the purging of communists, first in Shanghai, but also in Wuhan. Those two cities were very important, along with Nanjing or Nanking. And that was where the Kuomintang, the KMT, had their power. Remember, the communists had control of other areas, and eventually the Civil War would spread throughout the whole country. But the main power of the nationalist government was in the south. So there were two KMT or nationalist governments at the same time. So it gets even more complicated. Not only did you have nationalists versus communists, you also had a split in the Nationalist Party and two governments. One was the government of Chiang Kai-shek in Nanjing, and the other government was Wang Jingwei. Wang Jingwei was the leader of the government in Wuhan, and it was more of a left-wing government. So Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Jingwei, they were a right wing and a left wing, a right wing and a left wing of the KMT, the Nationalist Party, and they were rivals. Eventually, Chiang Kai-shek would win out, and communists were expelled from Shanghai and from Nanjing and also from Wuhan, and so they were forced to go to the Jiangxi province. So that was the purging that happened starting in 1927. And at that time, a man named Mikhail Borodin had to leave and go back to the Soviet Union. I want to tell you just a little bit about Borodin. Mikhail Borodin was a student at Valparaiso University in Indiana. That is my alma mater. What? This was a man who participated in the Bolshevik Revolution and was actually a revolutionary at the beginning of the Bolshevik Party. He was a close friend of Vladimir Lenin. And so he was Russian. He was a Russian Jew. And as a result, he faced discrimination, and eventually that would lead to the end of his career and his imprisonment and the end of his life, even though he was a committed communist in communist Russia. Well, Mikhail Borodin, in 1903, he was a part of the reformers, the group of reformers that eventually pushed for the revolution of 1905. If you remember from previous history in our other course, you may remember that there was a day called Bloody Sunday, and that was when the Tsar basically cracked down on protesters, and it led to protests all over the country, strikes, and it did lead to some reforms, but they were short-lived, and eventually the Tsar took back his promises. Well, Borodin was one of those reformers, but because he was an agitator, he was one of these revolutionaries, he was forced to leave the country, and he came to the United States. When he came to the United States, he learned English fluently. He went to Valparaiso University, and he also went to law school, and he learned English so well that he actually became an English teacher here in the United States. And this is all between the Revolution of 1905 and the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. So during those 12 years, 15 years in between, he went to Valparaiso, he became an English teacher, and he taught at Hull House. Now, you may not remember this, but Hull House was a place for immigrants, and it was a very famous ministry, a service for people as they transitioned into the United States. And that's something that is important to remember, that Borodin was a part of that. And he loved America. But he loved Russia maybe even more. And he eventually went back to Russia after the Russian Revolution. He was a part of everything that was happening, all the changes that were taking place. And then he was commissioned by Lenin. He was sent by Lenin to China to assist the Kuomintang, the nationalists, with the setting up of their government, especially Sun Yat-sen. And so Borodin worked with Sun Yat-sen, and Borodin was one of those communists / a left-wing member of the Nationalist Party. But in 1927, he was forced to return to the Soviet Union, and he lived the rest of his life there. He worked in the Russian government, the Soviet government, but eventually, because of his Jewish heritage, he was persecuted and put in prison, and he died. But after his death, he was remembered as a hero again once things, the government changed. One thing that happened immediately when Japan invaded China in 1931 after the Manchurian incident. Back in 1931, Chiang Kai-shek already had the understanding that China had to preserve its culture from the invaders and from war. And he knew that the Japanese would love the treasures of the Forbidden City in Beijing. And so he created them all up. There were 20,000 crates of treasures that were sent south to avoid first the Japanese, and then eventually they moved around some more. They were kept in a Taoist monastery in Nanjing for a while after the war, but because of the Civil War and the communists fighting against the nationalists, those crates of treasures finally had to be moved to Taiwan. And today, the National Palace Museum is still in Taiwan. All of the treasures that made it, that was only about 22% of the whole amount of treasures that was shipped south. So many of them were taken back by the communists, and eventually they did end up in museums there. Many, though, were sold off to other countries, people who would pay a lot of money, and the communists needed money. And so a lot of China's culture and history disappeared during that civil war. When I lived in Taiwan, October was a great month. And the reason was, as a teacher, I kept getting holidays, days off of school. On October 26th, it was a special holiday. It was called Guangfujie, which means Retrocession Day. And it was a day remembering the giving back of Taiwan to China from Japan. Now, this is kind of strange because China, the China we know today, has never controlled Taiwan. But the Republic of China had owned Taiwan. I'll even say this. The Republic of China never owned Taiwan. It was the Qing dynasty. In 1895, the first Sino-Japanese War ended with a Japanese victory and the Qing dynasty humiliated. And so, as a result, Taiwan became a Japanese colony. So that was before the Republic of China even started. It's a little bit funny then to talk about Taiwan being given back to China, and a lot of Taiwanese people would disagree that that is even possible. But it was a holiday, and I enjoyed it. And I think it represents a very important idea that continued from the time that Chiang Kai-shek took his armies and millions of people and settled in Taiwan. This was a massive retreat, and in his mind, the idea of getting China back was very important to him. And so I believe that that's why that holiday became so meaningful to people in the Republic of China, which was Taiwan for since 1949 all the way to the present day. Taiwan is the Republic of China. It's the only Republic of China that exists. Remember that mainland China is called the People's Republic of China, and it's different. Anytime you have peoples in the name, it's usually a communist nation. Well, Chiang Kai-shek began a process of breaking with the Communist Party back in 1927. We've already mentioned that he saw Mao and the communists as his rivals, and he decided to do something about it. And what he did was called the White Terror. Now, the White Terror was the purging of communists, first in Shanghai, but also in Wuhan. Those two cities were very important, along with Nanjing or Nanking, and that was where the Kuomintang, the KMT, had their power. Remember, the communists had control of other areas, and eventually the Civil War would spread throughout the whole country. But the main power of the nationalist government was in the south. So there were two KMT or nationalist governments at the same time. So it gets even more complicated. Not only did you have nationalists versus communists, you also had a split in the Nationalist Party and two governments. One was the government of Chiang Kai-shek in Nanking, Nanjing, and the other government was Wang Jingwei was the leader of the government in Wuhan, and it was more of a left-wing government. Jiang had to evacuate his armies to Taiwan, and that led to what was called a terrible incident, and it's called the February 28th incident, also known as 228. In Chinese, numbers are important, and they often refer to incidents by the dates, not the years, which are based on a Western calendar, but they refer to the numbers of the dates. So February 28th, 228 was a day when things exploded in Taiwan. Because when Jiang brought all of his Chinese soldiers to Taiwan, Taiwan already had a government. They already had a society. And at first they welcomed the Chinese, but then they realized that this was going to be a huge burden on Taiwanese society. And so some people spoke out and didn't want to do what the Chinese soldiers told them to do. And there was a confrontation on February 28th in 1947. An old woman was selling cigarettes, and a Chinese soldier confronted her, wanted her cigarettes, wanted her to stop, and she refused, and he hit her with a gun, and as a result there was a crowd that had developed, and they attacked the soldiers, and the soldiers fired at them, and pretty soon you have soldiers killing the Taiwanese, and you also had Taiwanese people lynching mainlanders who had come with Jiang's army. It was a terrible time, and it's finally being discussed today, even though it resulted in martial law where the military controls everything like police. And for 40 years, from 1947 to 1987, people did not have freedom in Taiwan. They had a curfew each night, and my wife remembers that period. It was a time of order, but it was also a time of corruption where the government was taking things from everyday people in Taiwan. Well, that period is something that we need to study more about so that we can understand what Taiwan has gone through, and also so we can understand the difficulties faced by the Chinese as they evacuated their homeland, maybe never to return. Let's talk about what was happening as Chiang Kai-shek was beginning to realize that he could not continue to keep hold of China. After the communists had been successful in Manchuria, claiming Manchuria after Japan left, the communists began to march south. They took Beijing, then they took Shanghai, then they took Nanjing, and the whole time Chiang Kai-shek had to retreat with his army. So, long story short, the communists won. And Jiang's army was forced to retreat, and there was always this dream of someday returning to recapture mainland China, and the United States supported that dream as a part of their global Cold War that they were fighting against the Soviets and now against China as well. And so the United States would soon fight wars in Korea and then in Vietnam as a part of this global conflict with communism. So October 1st, not a holiday in Taiwan, at least not one that was celebrated when I was there. Who knows about the future? But October 1st, 1949 is the founding of the People's Republic of China, when Mao Zedong said to crowds, "We have stood up." And there's a certain part of us that wants to appreciate what the Chinese people were going through at that time. They felt that they had been pushed around, and as a country, they were more unified than they'd ever been. And the peasants were behind this new government. In 1952, the government implemented the first of its 5-year plans. Now, this idea, you may remember, comes from the Soviets. The idea that you start a 5-year plan and you start cheerleading and get everybody behind your plan for economic development, and in particular, industrial development. And so China started implementing changes, and the goal was to have industrialization and also agricultural collectivism. So reshaping how private property had been owned. They abolished private property and created large collectives so that more land could be farmed together. And so, no one would get rich off of the backs of poor people. That still happened because corruption still existed. But after the first 5-year plan from 1952 to 1957, Mao realized that things weren't going as well as he hoped. In fact, during the time of industrialization, the emphasis was on steel. The idea that if only China can produce its own steel, they can build anything. And so Mao actually was hoping for grassroots industrialization, and he encouraged people to have steel furnaces in their backyards. And so what people were doing is finding scrap metal, and they would start melting it together, and they made what was called pig iron. Pig iron is like the lowest quality of steel. And yes, it can be used to build some things, but it's not in demand. It's not something you could export, or it's not valuable. And so that's what was happening on the industrialization side. And on the agricultural side, this plan was not allowing them to farm as they had for centuries. And so there was a lot of resistance, and they were exporting some of the food that they were supposed to be using to feed their own people. In 1957 began what was called the Great Leap Forward. And Da Yue Jin is what it is in Chinese. And it sounds like a cheer, right? Da Yue Jin. Everybody was excited. They got behind Mao, but again, the things that had been going wrong got even worse. And this triggered the Great Chinese Famine. And estimates are that as many as 50 million people died over the next 5-year period, called the Great Leap Forward. It's such an ironic term. It's a horrible time in Chinese history when people were suffering. The government was supposed to be making things better. That led, during the middle of the 1960s, to a decline in Mao's popularity, because the peasants had depended on him, and now he had totally let them down and was not doing what he said he was going to do. To consolidate his power and regain his power, Mao basically started another revolution called the Cultural Revolution against all of the counter-revolutionaries. His claim was that capitalism was creeping back into China, and it needed to be purged once again. And so this Cultural Revolution lasted from 1966 to 1976, a 10-year period. Now, technically, Mao declared that it was over in 1969, but he had set machinery in motion by getting the people so riled up, and they worshipped him in a kind of personality cult. They thought of him as a god, and because of that, they would do whatever he said, and terrible things happened. Mao's wife was one of the main cheerleaders of the Cultural Revolution, fighting against anybody who was seen as a capitalist. Many scholars were accused of being capitalists, of being counter-revolutionaries against the communist revolution. And so her name was Jiang Qing, and Jiang Qing was the wife of Mao and was one of 4 people who were called the Gang of Four, who led the country in this time of frenzied fight against anyone who was seen as an enemy. And, again, millions of people were killed during this period, and the country's economy was in tatters. They were purging counter-revolutionaries and parading them down the streets. They made them wear a cone that on the cone was written their crimes, and they had to wear signs. They were humiliated. Some were sent into exile, others were executed. And the worst was when, in this frenzy, certain people in certain small villages were told that their leaders were so evil that they had to destroy them and eat them. Cannibalism. And recently there's finally been discussions of these terrible things that happened in the evil darkness of this cultural revolution. After the Cultural Revolution, after Mao had died in the early 70s, in 1976, finally people recognized that the Gang of Four was evil, and they were put in prison, and China acknowledged that this was the worst thing that could have happened to progress in China. In 1976 was one of those number incidents, a day that's remembered in Chinese culture. It's 4/5, April 5th, and it was the Tiananmen incident. And students gathered in Tiananmen, and they were wanting more freedom. They didn't get everything they wanted, but the man who had become leader was named Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping was understanding that the way for China to move forward was to embrace capitalist thinking and capitalist ideas while maintaining a communist way of life. So that's China today. And it took 30 years for China to really be recognized for the growing economy that they are. And who knows how long that will continue. But that is, again, the fall from grace of the Gang of Four and the rise of Deng Xiaoping until the next Tiananmen incident in 1989. Now, finally, briefly, we need to talk about what changed as China emerged from the Cultural Revolution. Leaders like Deng realized that China needed to change. And in 1971, there was a breaking of the ice between the West and China. And Richard Nixon was a big part of this. And even though he was later completely discredited and seen as an embarrassment to the United States because of his Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon knew how to embrace China at the right moment. Politically, it was better for the United States, and also economically. Now, Nixon was very wise in embracing China, but you need to know that China's leader was also someone who had been flexible in history. His name was Zhou Enlai. He had been working together with Chiang Kai-shek. He had been Chiang Kai-shek's student. He worked together with Mao, but he survived Mao. He survived the Cultural Revolution, and he was able to start bringing China into the modern era. And that happened in 1971 when the Republic of China on Taiwan had been representing all of China in the United Nations from the time that the United Nations was founded in the 1940s after the war. And so the United States said we can no longer recognize Taiwan as China. And so recognition, I should say, in the United Nations, Taiwan lost China's seat, and the People's Republic of China took China's seat. And that's the way it's been ever since. That was in 1971. Now, during the decade of the 70s, there was a gradual moving toward China and away from Taiwan for the U.S. as well. But the United States recognized that Taiwan could be Western and even a democracy if given some time to develop. So in 1979, the Taiwan Relations Act was adopted, passed into law by Congress in the United States, and diplomatic recognition was switched from Taiwan to China. This meant that Taiwan was not considered to be an official country by the United States, but the Taiwan Relations Act meant that the United States government swore, and it's in law, that they would help Taiwan defend itself so that communist China couldn't just quickly come and swallow up Taiwan. And this is extremely important because Taiwan today is a thriving democracy because of that agreement and because China knows that it can't simply come and take Taiwan. Taiwan during the 1960s experienced an economic miracle. The leaders in the KMT, the Nationalist Party, finally realized that they were not going back to China anytime soon, maybe never. And so they started developing the Taiwanese economy, and it became an incredible force economically, more powerful than China. And eventually Taiwan businessmen would invest in China and create factories. And it was incredible, kind of the servant becoming the master in a sense. Maybe that's changing back now, but Taiwan has a very developed economy as a result. China is rising, but China is experiencing the fact that its cheap labor has been a big part of its economic growth. And now that people are wanting a better standard of living, it may not be possible for China to continue to grow as it has. I hope that this helps you understand where China's come from through a civil war and how it's emerging today, but the fact that there are still two Chinas in some people's minds. And we'll see how that develops. Thanks for watching.